Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every week, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me, and most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. This episode is part of the California Leadership Series, where we focus on changemakers in California government who are shaping the most innovative energy and climate policy anywhere, transforming the world's fifth largest economy and beyond. Our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series is Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. Lyft is preferred by drivers and passengers for its reliable and friendly experience and its commitment to effecting positive change for the future of our cities as the first rideshare company to launch a carbon offset program. And now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. I sat down with Commissioner Carla Peterman in her San Francisco offices on an atypically quiet day at the California Public Utilities Commission. I've been an admirer of the Commissioner's work on issues ranging from energy efficiency to renewables, advanced automotive to energy storage. Carla is an expert in decarbonization policy and energy markets and received her PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at Berkeley. She was an energy policy researcher at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and was summa cum laude in her class at Howard University. She's not just an energy wonk. She knows a thing or two about business and finance, having spent time at Lehman Brothers and having received her MBA at Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, sharing the rarefied league of President Bill Clinton, Senator Cory Booker, and Ambassador Susan Rice. Governor Jerry Brown first appointed Peterman to the California Energy Commission in 2011, where among many things she oversaw the state's aggressive renewable portfolio standard. She was then appointed to the CPUC, where she has served since December of 2012. She has the distinction of being the first African-American woman appointed to the commission, as well as being the youngest appointed commissioner. She sits on the board of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, has received numerous awards and accolades, and in spite of all of this, is a warm and down-to-earth person. I think you'll enjoy our conversation. Commissioner Carla Peterman, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I want to start really at the beginning of your journey and kind of understand how you came to public service, but also how you became an environmentalist. I understand that you're from South Orange, New Jersey. Can you talk a little bit about what growing up there was like for you?
Sure, yes. From South Orange, New Jersey, and I like to talk about New Jersey being this other bastion of environmental beauty and policy in the states because there's lots of rivers and agriculture. It is the Garden State. And New Jersey is also number 2, I think, in solar production. And so they've also had aggressive clean energy policies. But my introduction to the environment really came from my older brother, Chad. When I was 16, he was in college, and he gave me 2 very important gifts that changed my life. The first was for Christmas. He gave me Aldo Leopold's Sam County Almanac, which is a story about this Midwestern ecologist, conservationist, and it's just vignettes about wildland areas in the Midwest and how they changed as predators changed, as hunting and human interaction. And my big takeaway from that book was that humans can have a real impact on the environment and that there can be unintended consequences. The same Christmas, he shared with me a term paper he'd written about Love Canal in New York. And in Love Canal, New York, there was issues with pollution and contamination of groundwater. And it was a story about the intersection of law and policy and poverty and communities. And that's what inspired me to think about environmental justice and thinking about justice through the lens of the environment. So thanks to my brother, he gave me these 2 perspectives that I've carried with me the following years.
That's incredible. I think about the gifts of my older sisters. They weren't quite as profound, but they were, the Beatles' White Album and Simon and Garfunkel's Greatest Hits, I think.
Okay,
and they
well,
also had a huge impact on me, actually.
Well, I will say, if we're going down that route, my brother exposed me to Jimi Hendrix and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band, which two favorites still.
Awesome.
So older siblings can be pretty awesome.
So was nature a part of your growing up? I mean, how did your brother? Not that we have to go too far into his story, but I mean, where did this come from? Were you guys an outdoorsy family?
Not at all. We went to parks, but the first time I went camping was in college. And I think probably similar for my brother, but he became very much into outdoor activities in college and shared that with me. But the fact that so I initially was born in Newark, New Jersey, which is a much more urban area. And that's where my family had been from. And so when I first started thinking about environmentalism, I always thought about it, frankly, as something for people who were into spotted owls and trees, something distinct from the community I was a part of and the people that I knew. So it became really eye-opening for me to think about environmentalism in a more broader context and just about how do we preserve the places where we work, live, and play. I went to Howard University for college in DC, historically Black college. And at that university, I started an environmental organization and called Hughes, Howard University Environmental Society, that was very focused on how do we make environmentalism relevant to those of us who live in urban areas who don't come from typical wilderness or Sierra Club endorsing communities. And so kind of going back to your question, New Jersey had an influence on me because I didn't have a typical environmental experience, but I got to think about the environment and think about what that it means something no matter where you come from.
And you studied history at Howard,
did.
Is that right? Mm-hmm. What vein of history, or what was your main interest?
So I studied general history, but I actually focused towards the end on Russian and I know he's smiling at me. It's very topical. Actually, Russian and German history, which again was pretty cool to study those things at historically Black college. But I studied history because I'm really interested in how the world works. And I majored in history, but I did double minors in environmental science and biology because I was very interested in seeing the world from a physical systems perspective. And I felt that that course of study was really illuminating, and probably I missed philosophy somewhere in there, but really prepared me to work on the intersection of policy and science in the way I do today.
So did you have a sense at that time that that was the intersection that you were going for?
I did. I wanted to be an environmental attorney. This was, again, reading the paper about Love Canal and understanding how the legal system has an important role to play in ensuring environmental protection. I thought that's what I wanted to do. And what changed for me, I went on to graduate school, and I was in a graduate program in environmental management where I started taking courses on energy. And prior to graduate school, again, I had been thinking about environmental work, but not about specifically focusing on energy. But the more I looked at energy, the more I realized that what we do in our energy system has significant impacts on the environment. And if we do policy right up front, we can avoid those impacts and avoid having to have protracted legal battles about how to clean up sites, how to make sure certain communities are protected. And so that steered me more towards thinking about energy policy and the realm and vast wide array of jobs that you can actually do in that space.
So I know that you went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and I know that you also studied at Said, so you got your MBA there. Did you study other topics as well while at Oxford?
I did. So the first master's program I did there was called Environmental Change and Management.
Okay, so that was at Oxford.
It was interdisciplinary environmental program. And there I did a focus on energy economics. And that's what really brought forward my interest in thinking about how the world works from a financial perspective. I guess I thought to myself, well, I know history and I know how it works from a science perspective, but if money makes the world go round, I should learn a bit more about that. So after my master's program, I still had scholarship funding. And so I completed my MBA at Oxford as well, and just got a real better understanding of how corporations work, why they do what they do, which I think is important. If as a policymaker, I make decisions that affect companies' bottom lines every day. So it's helpful to have a more insight into what that impact really is and what motivates them. Because a good policy incentivizes people to do what you want them to do and is consistent with what they want to do as well. So I try to find that sweet spot.
Okay, so let's come back to the U.S. then. So you spent, 2 or 3 years in England?
I did. I spent 3 years in England, long enough to sound like I had a British accent to Americans, but not to the British.
Right. Oh, and I'd be
And make a good cup of tea, of course.
yeah, and eat a lot of bad food, I'm
Yeah.
sure.
A lot of chips.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask what college you were a member of.
So I was first at Oriel College, and then my second degree was at New College, and I actually worked at Balliol for a year. So I've seen an array. I actually my first dorm room was a couple doors down from where Robert Hooke discovered the cell.
Wow.
And so that was the nice thing about being in Oxford. You talk about history, you're kind of steeped in it.
Yeah, that's incredible. Okay, so what was your first move when you came back stateside?
So I came stateside and I took a job working as an investment banker for Lehman Brothers. And I worked primarily in the power group. And again, I was interested in using my business school skills. It's the type of job that you get if you're going to get it right out of business school.
Yeah.
And I thought it'd be a nice opportunity to kind of marry some of my interests. I went there thinking I could work on renewable energy projects or with that desire. But this was in the early 2000s, and the big banks weren't doing major investments at that point in renewable energy projects. So I spent most of my time working on natural gas plant acquisitions or sales, as well as some mergers and acquisitions of companies. And, again, it gave me a good sense of why power companies invest in what they invest in. What are some of the considerations they have in their day-to-day business?
Long-term assets.
Yeah. And also the cycles. I mean, I think what I appreciated during that time was we were thinking about at that time there was an overbuild of gas plants, but there had been a shortage of them, a few years before that. And so kind of getting a better sense of what it takes to build long-term assets and the life spans of these assets can be 50, 60 years. And so how do we think about good policy? Like, how do we send a signal that's going to hold for 50 or 60 years and a signal that the market can adapt to?
I want to talk more a little bit later about signals that states can send versus the federal government and maybe some of the confusion today around that. But I assume that you were in New York for Lehman Brothers. And what brought you west?
Yeah, so I kind of came dragging west. I was happy to be back near New Jersey, near my family, and so thought I'd stay on the East Coast. But I decided after about 2 years in banking that I wanted to do something else. I wanted to continue working on clean energy issues and something that I wasn't able to do as easily there. And so I quit my job and I took a piece of paper and I told myself, write down what you want to be. You can be anything in the world you want to be. And I thought about it. And it turned out there wasn't a lot of other different stuff I wanted to be. I kept coming back to something around the environment, either environmental writing or something with environmental policy. And I was thoughtful about whether I should apply for a job or go back to school. And ultimately, I decided to go back to school to get my PhD because I had been in England for several years. I hadn't been as steeped in California environmental and energy policy and wanted to do that. And I didn't want to have one particular organization's vantage point. And so I pursued a PhD so I could just learn as much as possible and then decide kind of when and where and how I would re-enter this space. And so I was deciding between a school in Connecticut, New Jersey, Michigan, and California for graduate school. And I came to visit the UC Berkeley one week in March, and it was in the 80s. And then I went to visit University of Michigan the following week, and it was in the negatives. And so, suffice it to say, I moved to California and went to UC Berkeley and did my PhD there in the Energy and Resources group.
And you were doing research at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab as well. What kind of work were you doing there?
Yes. So, I mean, the reason I chose Cal and the reason I recommend it to others is because you get to work with so many leaders and organizations within this space. The energy environmental ecosystem is so interconnected and so vast and so supportive in California and so deep. So when I was a student at University of California, Berkeley, I had a research position at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I worked with a group that was doing the first of its kind tracking of residential and commercial rooftop solar cost and incentives. The series reports, and it's called the Tracking the Sun reports. And so I worked on the first two, and where we collected data from the Public Utilities Commission, other state commissions on the projects they were incentivizing. I remember having to email staff who are now at the CPUC at that time as a graduate student and ask for their help. And they were very helpful, I will say.
Good for them.
They were.
Lucky for them.
Kind of speaking about the deeper bench that California has, probably the life-changing opportunity I had my first year was I interned at the Public Utilities Commission, where I currently am. I had the opportunity to be here for a summer. I worked on a project that was really interesting, and I actually got to see my suggestions and opinions reflected in the final decision. And I thought, where else can you work where, as someone in your 20s, you can impact a state that has nearly 40 million people? And I shadowed a commissioner during that time, and I said, well, her job is pretty interesting. She gets to do scientific things and policy stuff, but seems to have a lot of power, and people respect her. I might want to do this.
What commissioner was that?
This was Commissioner Diane Grunick at the time.
She was great.
And I got just by sitting and observing her one day. And so I've let people shadow me in my role, because it took me, I was well into my 20s, nearly my early 30s, before I really had a good grasp, and maybe I'm still getting it, about what a commissioner does and the way a commissioner can influence environmental policy as well as broader resource policy and kind of cost issues. And so that just left a spark in me that this would be the type of institution I might like to work at one day. And I've been privileged over the years to get to the point now to be a commissioner here.
So how did you go from your PhD work to landing your first job as a commissioner of the CEC? Or was there something in between that I'm missing?
No, those are the formal job titles that did the transition. And what I'll say, and sometimes I get asked this by students, especially interns, when they ask about the pathway. When I was a PhD student, I always knew I wanted to do work that was very real world, applied, and applicable. And in academia, you have to make sure you satisfy your academic requirements and the academic community needs. But that can be different than what the policy community might be doing or seeking. So I made an intentional effort during my time in graduate school to be active in policy discussions. So the first thing I did was just to become an expert on the latest policy. I would offer to give lunchtime talks at the UC Energy Institute, at LB&L, in my department about the energy policy acts that were coming out. Or new regulations that were coming out. And that gave me a chance to learn, get up to speed, and hone my presentation skills. I would speak for free at any place that would be willing to accept me. The second thing I did was just talk to people who are working in the space and strengthening those connections. So one of the important ones for my appointment was I served on the board of TURN, the Utility Reform Network. And they're a big consumer advocacy group that practices and before the commission. And I was at a conference and I met the executive director of TURN, and he was asking me about my research, and I was telling him about it and my background. And we had coffee a few more times in the upcoming months. And he said, I'm looking to, we need new board members. We're looking to have a board that is more diverse, more representative of some of the new thinking that's coming out of the universities. Are you interested? And so I said, yes. And I don't think I truly appreciated at the time the influence that TURN has. But as a graduate student, I served on their board. So I think that was critical. And so then these things were moving along. I was thinking about what job to do next after graduation. And I talked to my dissertation advisor, told him my interest. And he asked me if I thought about something in Sacramento. And I wasn't really sure how to pursue something like that. Governor Brown had been elected, just figuring out his administration. And my advisor said, well, if you have a resume or a website, I can pass it along to people who are looking to fill appointments. Just as a fun fact, the governor has like 700 appointments that he or she has to fill. And many of them aren't full-time. Some are part-time, but there's a lot. And you might be qualified for one of them and not even know it. So I got my name came before the governor and his staff, and they were interested in my background and the perspectives that I could bring, and did a few interviews, and voila, I had a job in Sacramento.
That's incredible. So it's obviously you had the subject matter expertise that you had developed academically, and also probably to some extent through your work experience at Lehman's, although that wasn't quite energy specific, but
well, because I mean, I did work on power plant financing. I mean, the way I think about it, again, I won't assume why the governor, all the reasons why the governor appointed me to the role, but the way I think about it is I have discrete experience with several of the different stakeholder groups that you have to find balance between in order to be a commissioner. And enough experience to be credible, but not so much to be viewed as biased, one-sided, or to be universally hated. So kind of hopefully I hit it just at the right time of expertise and experience to be considered for the CEC.
And also, I think the ability and proclivity to this is an overused term, but lean in or kind of step up. And I love this concept of giving lunchtime talks for free as a way of helping people out in your academic community, but also kind of exercising your chops, your public speaking chops.
Hone your skills.
Expanding your network.
That's important. I mean, a lot of what my job, a lot of what being a commissioner entails that's different from the senior staff you work with is having to communicate the message externally and in a more public venue. I'm an extrovert by nature, so a lot of it comes naturally, but also it came with practice. I mean, in the time you spent. I mean, I remember I did a presentation in Marin for an environmental group. I stayed up all night to work on it, to prepare this PowerPoint. I don't have to do that anymore, but you have to do it the first few times you go at it. I've spoken at churches, like I've done presentations on environmental stewardship and the Baptist community and what it means for what the Bible says about environmentalism, because there's just so many different ways to approach this topic, and we need to bring so many more people in. We've got to be able to communicate on these issues with people as it relates to the issues that they care about.
We really do, and as you pointed out before, the traditional environmentalist community is white. It's male.
I'm Black and female for listeners who don't know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
And we've faced some challenges getting through policy in California because it isn't inclusive enough. So, for example, cap and trade has been met with a lot of concerns from environmental justice advocates and communities. Are we getting there? Are we doing a better job of bringing in more perspectives and addressing concerns of a broader constituency?
I think we are in several ways. One of the ways is, so even though there's been an interest in doing that, I think there's always been a question about how do you do that, or how do you fit attention to disadvantaged communities, communities of color, into our traditional rate-making framework, our proceeding framework. For those who haven't had a chance to work with the PUC, our process can be fairly adversarial. We're debating billions of dollars in rate cases, and so you need to be an expert lawyer to oftentimes follow what we're doing. And we've had this question ongoing, which is how do we keep the authenticity, transparency, and vigor of our process while also making it inclusive and respectful of the expertise that members of the public bring just by being from their communities or being affected by the systems that we approve. And so I think one thing that's been really critical for introducing environmental justice issues better into our forums and the Energy Commission and others has been Cal EPA's EnviroScreen. And this is a metric where they look at various indicators in the community that affect economic and environmental health. And they rank communities based on these metrics and identified there's X percent of communities are in the top. They look at what the top, say, 25% of communities are that are most affected by some of these environmental indicators and economic indicators. That analysis is something that we've now been able to use in several of our proceedings. And I'll give you a couple examples. So we've been approving over the last 2 years utility investments in electric vehicle charging. charging for single-family homes, charging for ports and trucks, for commercial dwellings. But we want to make sure that at least a significant percentage of those investments go into disadvantaged communities or communities that suffer disproportionately from environmental harm. How do you identify those communities? The Cal Enviro Screen is something that we use to identify those communities. And we have done things like require higher incentives to go to investments that happen in the top 25% of those Cal Enviro Screen zip codes. We require a certain amount of the projects to go there. And we've done that through several proceedings now at the Commission, through our proceeding that funds small-scale storage, for example. So I think, first of all, we're making progress because we're putting some quantification around these issues. We are clearly articulating that there is a need to address community concerns and to facilitate community participation. So as a part of that transportation work, we had 4 regional community meetings where we didn't just have people tell us what they thought. We had a dialogue with them. Hey, this is what we're thinking about approving. What do you think? And we really focused on having them in areas that are often more excluded. Like we had one in Richmond, we had one in Fresno, and went to those communities because the community said, we need you to come here. You can't just have the meeting in San Francisco because Richmond's different from San Francisco. So long story, long answer to a question, which is these issues are important. The communities have been excluded from the process. You can give a good reason for why, but it doesn't make it right. And we're working on various initiatives to improve that.
What are you learning in these meetings, such as the 2 that you pointed out?
Well, it's a range of things. I mean, so what I expected to learn is that these communities, so I would say broadly, when you think about utilities investing in good initiatives, there's support for those initiatives, but concerns about the impact on rates. Because even when you invest in good things, that costs money and that can drive up people rates and that can have some unintended negative consequences. But what I heard more from the people in these communities, even though many of the population probably more sensitive to higher electricity prices, they wanted to see these projects because for them, it's a matter of life or death. When the air quality is so bad that they have asthma, their kids have asthma, they're willing to divert more of their money to electricity bill if they think it's going to help to clean the air. And so really I was touched by people's personal stories. The other kind of interesting factoid I'll highlight, what I appreciate at some of these meetings too, is that in different parts of the state, there are organizations that are trying innovative approaches that may not always be before us. So in Fresno, we talked to some gentlemen who operate, I would call kind of an Uber or Lyft, but not Uber or Lyft, an informal one in the Central Valley. I think it's called Ride Sharos or something. And it's the idea that community members give other community members rides. And you need that particularly in places like the Central Valley because the public transportation isn't as robust. People live further distances from towns. And so I also recognize that there might be good transportation and electrification efforts happening that we need to support somehow. Like for those communities sharing rides, how do we get them on electric cars and how do we get them to charge? Now we have companies like Lyft and Uber talking to us about how they want to do that. But what about these more informal networks that could really benefit from it as well? And those aren't people who would be parties to our proceedings, but how can we think about getting them access to chargers? And we just want to know if we didn't go to the community and talk to them. I wish we could do more of the meetings. I mean, one of the challenges is it's a big state. And so, yes, we went to Fresno, but I wish we had a chance to go to Bakersfield. And so one of our challenges is figuring out how do we have more intimate conversations with people, given everyone's limitation on time and staff and bandwidth.
It's a challenge. It is a big state, and the economy is thriving, but still leaving a lot of people behind.
Yes.
At the same time. And now, a word from our sponsor. A special thanks to our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series, Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. And now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. This means that a decision to ride with Lyft is a decision to take a cleaner option, cleaner than driving yourself or riding with another company, and will fund efforts that are reducing emissions and combating climate change. This is a multi-million-dollar investment in the first year alone, which makes Lyft one of the top voluntary purchasers of carbon offsets in the world. In year one, Lyft anticipates offsetting over 1 million tons of carbon, equivalent to planting tens of millions of trees or taking hundreds of thousands of cars off the road. Lyft's investment and impact will continue to grow as the company does. Ride Lyft and join together in effecting positive change for the future of our cities. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. So I want to just come back to career for 1 second, because we missed one important step, which was from the California Energy Commission to the Public Utilities Commission, where we sit today, where you have served now for the past...
This is my 6th year.
6th year. And this is, how long is the term?
6 years.
6 years, okay. So we'll talk about the implications of that later. But how was that transition facilitated, and what was it like for you?
So the California Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission are sister agencies that have very complementary mandates. The Energy Commission does the state energy planning and policy, and the Public Utilities Commission regulates public utilities, including electric and gas. So we have real influence over the economic choices of the utilities. So I worked very closely with the PUC when I was at the Energy Commission. When I was there, I worked on transportation electrification issues, as well as gas and renewables. And one of the last things I worked on at the CEC was the independent Integrated Energy Policy Report, the IPER, which is a biannual document that the CEC puts out looking at the state of energy. And I did a focused report on renewable energy and what we were going to need to reach the 33% RPS target. And we came up with around, I think, 30 or so recommendations. And one of, several of the recommendations really pointed back to the Public Utilities Commission. The need, for example, for the Public Utilities Commission to do a deeper analysis into the distribution grid and making sure it had robust capacity to facilitate distributed energy resources. And so I've been doing this work and really appreciating that there was a lot of important work to happen at the CPUC. And then, to be frank, the governor's office called me and asked if I was interested in it. I kind of think if you're in a position that you really like and you're happy with, that's when someone calls you to do something else.
Right.
And I appreciate that. I think there was an appreciation by several folks out there for the work I had been doing at the Energy Commission, and I took it as a compliment. That there was support for me taking on a role with more cases and probably, frankly, more pressure and a little bit more challenges anytime you're dealing with the finances. And when thinking about whether to make the move, because by the time I started when I started the CEC, I got into a relationship with my now husband. We were living in the Sacramento area. And so it was a lifestyle change for me to take a job in San Francisco. And I did the commute for the first 5 years of my term. But I ultimately decided to take the job because I thought if I'm really serious about advancing clean energy initiatives and fighting climate change, I should be willing to deploy my skills at this other agency, which is taking on some of these really big questions in the next few years. And once I looked at it like that, it was just a matter of kind of changing my position for the same team. And I took the job.
And your portfolio, I mean, when you think back to your initial desire to work on renewables and the energy transformation. I mean, that's exactly what you're working on, right? You have energy efficiency, you have renewables, you have transportation, the transportation transformation. What am I missing?
I have a range, though. I had renewables, I was saying, until last year, and then now one of my colleagues has it. But during the course of my time, I've worked on RPS, energy storage, energy efficiency. I feel like I'm missing one. It's like your children, you hate to get it wrong. Transportation electrification. I also have general rate cases, phases of those for Southern California Edison, PG&E. I have the PCIA rulemaking, which is looking at cost allocation between CCAs and utilities. Sounds really wonky, but super important if you care about that stuff. I mean, so I have just been able to, frankly, personally been involved in so many critical decisions. When I started on transportation electrification, the PUC did not allow the utilities to invest at all in that space into electric vehicle charging. Um, One of my rulings in 2014 that the commission approved removed that cap on utility investment. And here we are less than 4 years later, and in total, we've approved nearly $1 billion in utility investments in electric vehicle charging. With energy storage, when I started, we had a proceeding that had been open for a couple of years to look at implementing or setting targets for energy storage as directed by the legislature. And when I got here, we'd done work and we knew that there was opportunity for storage to work, but there weren't guarantees. And as the assigned commissioner, I had to make the call on what to recommend to the commission. And so I recommended, 6 months into my term, that we set targets. And the targets were such that at the time, they would have doubled the amount of non-hydro pump storage in the world. Someone once told me that someone in utility read the decision, read the proposal from me and fell out of their chair. I don't know if that's true, but kind of what is she thinking? But you have to kind of go big. And at that time, I remember we thought, we don't know if this is going to work, but we set our targets in a way that they were aggressive, but that ratepayers were protected. Like if the utility couldn't find cost-effective and viable storage, they didn't have to buy it. So I looked at it from the perspective of the worst case scenario is we were seen as being premature in this policy, maybe wasting a little regulatory time figuring it out, but no harm, no foul, no cost. And if we succeed, we can actually provide this grid asset that can help integrate renewables that is considered the holy grail kind of missing asset. And we did. Thankfully, utilities, storage developers, they all showed up. We set a policy, we set the signal to say, we want to see this happen, and they delivered. And we've seen more storage be procured at cheaper prices than we could have anticipated. And so I am gratified as a person interested in this work to see it happen, but super stoked that I actually personally got to have a hand in it.
It's incredible, and it's setting an example really for the world. And I want to circle back to that in a second, but expanding from your career and thinking about how people who are interested in doing this work can get involved. And obviously, when I say this work, it's pretty broad. So we should probably focus on energy policy.
Okay.
Since that's really what we're talking about today. But can you talk about the types of jobs that the Energy Commission and the CPUC provide, and sort of the entry points for those jobs? And then maybe we can expand that a little bit to think about the private sector and where this is all going, what types of economic opportunities some of these changes are providing.
Sure. Well, the exciting thing about the work of the Energy Commission and the CPUC is that people with a vast array of skills are needed to do this work. And people who are interested in specific detail, from some of our strongest staff at the commission, are those who understand the intricacies of utility tax policy. Because tax policy can have a real impact on how much electricity rates cost in the end. So you need people who are experts in accounting and auditing. And then you need people who are interested in broad level policy, who are able to look at climate change policy and understand where California is situated relative to the world. The Energy Commission does the approval of power plants, and they need staff that is able to ensure that power plants get permitted in a way that's good for the environment and that they're in compliance. So they have biologists and geographers and water experts. We've got tons of lawyers, people with business degrees, lots of engineers. A lot of times what we're thinking about, talking about energy storage, you have to ask the question, first and foremost, before we fund it, does it work? How does the science work? How do we take this new technology, an electric vehicle or a battery, and integrate it into this grid that's over 100 years old? So my advice for people that if you want to work in this space, think about what you like to do. And there's a role that will fit what you like to do. You don't have to fit that role per se. So if you like to do analysis, there's a role for you. If you like to talk to people, if you like to network, if you like to do community building, if you're a community activist, I mean, I was talking about all the work we do on transportation electrification. Well, to organize the community meetings, we need people to go out and talk to community groups and see what the interest is. We need graphic designers who help us figure out how to display really complicated issues in an easy to understand format. We need translators. We translated most of our documents in several languages. We need people who understand marketing, people who understand policy, chemistry. I mean, I'm going to name everything you can study in school, so I'll stop. But you can really do anything and do this work.
Okay, so then the follow-on question is, because there's so many roles and so many potentially applicable skills, what is the path like? I mean, you took your own path and it was very much your path.
Right.
This is not like going to business school and then going to an investment bank,
Mm-hmm.
right? Do schools, does the CPUC recruit directly from schools?
Yes. So, and we're doing a lot more recruitment than we used to because for various reasons, we've gotten our workforce needs are greater. We have significant number of retirees, like a lot of organizations do. We also have gotten several new positions from the legislature to implement some of these new clean energy laws and policies. So I think our executive director said something like 50% of our workforce will turn over in the next 2 years. So
Wow, that's significant.
Yeah. Give or take a couple percentage. I can't remember the exact number, but significant. And so we have focused a lot on streamlining the application process. It is state service always has its own unique rules. But if folks are interested in jobs at any state agencies, go to the websites, learn how to take what are called the exams to be qualified for the positions. I will say things are really competitive right now. We're at a time where the economy overall has picked up, and there's a lot of interest in the issues that the PUC works on. So, in order to set yourself apart, you can come in. Many of the jobs you require a 4-year college degree, not all, but most. But what's really valuable is actually on the ground experience. So if you have two people who have the same degree, but one person has worked at an environmental organization or for local government or for a private organization, if they know the subject matter, they're gonna excel faster. And so you can get that expertise by doing what I did in graduate school, doing some personal study. These issues, the good thing about these issues is we're just figuring them all out. So there's not a massive history of stuff to read on energy storage. Just read the last 4 years of decisions. So you can educate yourself, get a job somewhere, and then apply to work at the Public Utilities Commission. I just like to tell people, just start somewhere. Like, you really can't go wrong. People say, oh, should I start in private sector or public sector? You might make a choice based on your own personal needs. But if you work in the public sector, you will be well positioned to work in private sector on energy policy, and then vice versa.
What's the culture? What's the work environment like here at the CPUC?
I would say overall it's good, but it varies. It depends on what you're working on, right? And so the issues we have so many issues that we work on that I think, see some cultural trends amongst different groups. Like, we have a group that does railroad safety, and there's a certain culture for them. There's those who work on energy policy. What we've been focusing on is trying to come up with more unifying messages for everyone, because explaining what we do can get complicated and pretty wonky. But at its really core, what we do is make sure that Californians have access to essential services. So that can be water, it can be electric, it can be gas, it can be railroad safety, but it's to make sure Californians have access. And part of having access is making sure that the companies that provide these services are healthy. And that's why we do rate cases, to make sure that they have the funding to do the investments in the system that we need. And so we're going back to our core focus again, to unite us. And really also just highlighting too the contributions that individual staff members make. We instituted, I think about 2 years ago, an employee recognition program to acknowledge the staff that help to support morale, that do innovation. Because, I mean, I'll tell you, some of the most important people in this agency, you're never going to know their name, but they're the ones who make sure that the decisions get published on time, that they're legal, that we can vote on them. I get the pleasure of having my name positively associated with a lot of this stuff, but there's hundreds of people who work wouldn't be possible without them. And so, I think the culture is one where, frankly, everyone's striving to work very hard, on issues that seem somewhat impossible to fix, but there's support and belief that it's the right mission.
So I want to circle back for a second to this idea of being on the bleeding edge of policy, or sometimes rolling out regulations that seem premature, or, or are criticized as being premature. And my feeling is, and you may share this, that we're in a race to save our planet, and California has put itself in a position over the last years, thanks really to the work that you're doing and that the stance that Governor Brown has taken and many others, that we're going to take risks, and we're going to be ambitious and aspirational in some of the target setting. I'm thinking of a conversation I had a couple years ago at one of the COPs. I think it was in Lima the year before Paris, and we were meeting with some of your colleagues from California, Cliff and Ken, and maybe a couple of others, and representatives from Israel. And Israel was wrestling with and wondering about how we could be so aggressive. At the time, our RPS was set at 33%. And, what kind of complications could this cause, both economically, but also in terms of reliable delivery of power? What has surprised you as we have sort of surpassed where, in some cases, where we thought we might be either on storage or RPS or some of the other issues, and where have we shot too far?
Well, I would first say I think what California does are calculated risk. We have big headlines, and the governor will make a big announcement of a goal, but then a lot of detailed work goes in behind the scenes to actually make the policy something that we can implement. And so when you really look into some of the details of the work that we've done, there's oftentimes a phasing in of different policies. There are targets that are set, and then you get to a certain point in that target and you evaluate it and you correct course. And for example, with our energy storage work, the legislation required that 3 years in, after setting targets, that we evaluate how well the program is working. Similarly, if you look at RPS, there are cost containment measures, and there are provisions for the utilities to come back and ask for certain reliefs if costs get too high. So I do think it's important to go in eyes wide open with being aggressive as possible, but protecting the Californians from the worst case scenario. And I think we've done a really good job around that. We also have, which can sometimes be intense, but also really valuable, a really engaged activist and academic community in California that call us on stuff. I read the blogs out there when I work on a decision and see what the economists are saying about what we're doing or what the environmental groups, and sometimes there's agreement, sometimes there's disagreement, but we have other people out there who are watching us to make sure that we are not making the worst decisions. And then also what California PUC does, and the only other area to do this is Washington, D.C., is we have intervener compensation, where you can be a nonprofit, environmental group, a community group, and you get paid to participate in our proceedings if you have contributions. Because that's sometimes a challenge in other places, is that you have one set of interests represented really well, the business interest. But how do you make sure that the business interests are balanced with all these other factors? And you have to give people an opportunity to earn a living advocating for the things that they believe in. So, and I want to kind of set that broadly. Do I think that we have gone too far on something? Time will tell. I do think that one of the exports that we want to do in California are innovation, good policy ideas. And given that we have tried a lot of different things, and we have a lot of different flowers blooming right now, if you will. We have, just on transportation, investments in EVs, but also fuel cell vehicles and hydrogen and biofuels, and natural gas we've invested in. And so I do think we are getting to the point where we need to look at our array of investments and be critical and honest about which ones are working, which ones are not, which ones have a path to success or not. And that can be hard to make the call to pull away funding from certain areas, because they're good projects, but the question is, are they the best use of our funds? I'm increasingly sensitive to this issue as a public utilities commissioner because ratepayer money is precious. It's, the money from my pocket. You get so much coming in the income, and it has to go to all these different initiatives. And so we want to make sure that if we're investing in energy efficiency, that's money that's not going to something else. So let's make sure we're getting the most for our investments. So I do think it's important that a lot of the stuff we've worked on so far has been piloting, particularly some of the things that I work on, and we need to see if those pilots are successful. Are energy storage systems helping to integrate renewables? Are they reducing greenhouse gases? Are there certain types of energy storage that are better to invest in than others? We're going to have a better sense of that in the next 5 years after more projects are developed. The same thing with electric vehicle charging. This is the first time we've had the utilities invest in this area. Are they going to be good agents to work with customers? We hope so, but we have a lot of metrics in place to evaluate their programs to see if they are, and if they're not, we'll course correct again.
So in looking at your career to date, there's two halves to this question. One is, what are you most proud of in terms of what you and your colleagues have accomplished? The other is, if you can think back to a time where you felt challenged, or where there was a failure or a setback that really put you back on your heels, and how you recovered from that.
Well, I'll start by saying every decision matters to somebody. And so I'm proud of all the decisions I've worked on, and some of the smaller ones, you can really see the immediate community or persons that they helped. But in terms of my interest, which is in overall reducing climate change, I'm very proud of the work that we've done on energy storage and transportation electrification, because it's groundbreaking. No other states are doing that. And we've seen other states now adopt the models that we have. I'm very proud, and I think we need to continue to grow our work on energy efficiency, but it's an area that California has proudly led on for the last 30 years. And so I see myself as continuing that work and figuring out how do we create more innovative programs to double. I mean, the challenge for energy efficiency is we need to find energy efficiency that we haven't found before. We have gotten a lot of the savings we're going to get out of changing lighting. We've been so successful that how do you get to deeper levels? That's pretty hard. And so I think that's a space that's continuing to become interesting, because we're asking questions that we haven't had to ask before. In terms of challenges with the job, or just professionally, one is that I can't and I don't work in isolation, and that the decisions, success is a result of things that I do, but also the legislature and the business community. And some things you just can't control. Some things sometimes luck breaks your way, and sometimes it doesn't. I recall when I was at the Energy Commission, 2 years in a row, there was two big pieces of legislation I was supportive of seeing pass that didn't. One was renewing the funding for the public interest energy research funds at the time, and that's now called EPIC. But that was collected through a charge, and that the legislature had to approve, and it lost. We worked really hard to provide information about why public research is important, and I thought we made a good case, but ultimately it didn't pass the legislature. And when they didn't pass that bill, that meant that we had several staff that had to find something else to do. And so that was a hard one, because you believe in the overall program, and you also feel some responsibility for not having explained it well enough to have legislators who represent the public see the value. Similarly, we had a situation like that with transportation funding at the Energy Commission, legislatively approved. It didn't get, the renewal didn't get approved. And again, just felt like we came home with a loss. But on both of those, eventually the legislature, in the few years that followed, ended up approving programs to replace both of those that are thriving. And so my big lesson is, what's a failure one day? You try the same thing again in a year and 2 years, it could succeed. A lot of it's just timing. And I've been, knock on wood, pretty lucky to ride some nice waves in terms of timing. But if our storage mandate didn't work, we should try it again. And if our electric vehicle programs for some reason don't work, we'll try it again. Like, the issues are too important not to.
So persistence and patience.
Persistence, patience, and perspective, which is like, when I first started at the Energy Commission, I went from being this grad student to being this commissioner. And I was asked to think about a plan for deploying distributed energy resources. And I remember being at home on a Saturday and just getting a little overwhelmed. Like, this is a lot of responsibility for me. I don't know. It's a lot of responsibility. And talking to a friend who said, it's not your job to fix all this. Like, you just have to write down your thoughts. And once you get some perspective that I have opportunity to make a real change in my role, but it's not my responsibility alone. And then you start to just embrace the community that you have to work on these issues with. It makes it a lot easier to manage.
So you started your career with such intention. Really, it seems to me that you envisioned this work. Exactly.
Yeah. It all kind of came together nicely at the end. There were some doubts along the way, but it came together.
Why are you doing the work today? I mean, you bring such energy and clarity of thought and vision to your work. And I know you have a toddler at home and you're burning the candle on both ends. But what gets you up in the morning?
First of all, I believe that climate change and greenhouse gases is one of the biggest problems our society will face. And so I'm committed to working on these issues. And I think that the work that we're doing at the PUC that I'm working on will be vital for that. But I also appreciate climate change isn't the only thing that people have to worry about. They have to worry about putting food on the table. They have to worry about their own safety, support their own careers. And so what I love about the PUC is that it's my job to balance lots of different competing interests and to not just think about reducing greenhouse gases, but also think about how to make sure we do it in an affordable manner. And I like complicated problems. I like fixing them. I like talking to people, clearly. And so this job lets me talk to people, work on really complicated issues that have a lot of importance. And that's why I do it.
So perhaps to end on, I understand that your commission terms out this year. Mm-hmm. What's next for Carla Peterman?
What's next, indeed? Well, suggestions welcome. I had the distinct honor of being the youngest person ever appointed to the Public Utilities Commission in California. And so I do have to have a job after this, which is, there's been others who've been able to leave, retire. And so I'll do something. Keeping open the possibility of staying in state service, either at the PUC or another agency. And also thinking, though, about where else I can be effective. Going back to what I said about how to get jobs in this space, the work that we need to do, it has to happen in private sector, public sector, academia. And so I feel a lot of comfort that I'm going to have value wherever I go. It's just a matter of where that is. So come interview me, ask me back next year, and I'll tell you what I'm doing.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Thanks again to the Sustainable Business Partner for the California Leadership Series, LIFT. To learn more about LIFT's carbon neutral program, visit lift.com/carbon. The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanke. Theme music is also by Ian Swanke. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or your preferred platform. And be sure to tell your friends and colleagues who want to make a difference. Thanks for listening. See you next week.